On this episode of Inside the WSOP, I'm going to talk about a hand that comes from a tournament I played down at Binions last week, so over on Fremont Street. It was a pretty good tournament, 1K buy-in, good structure. It was button ante as well, so it was a pretty fast-moving event and 1 hour levels. So we ended up playing a lot of poker over 2 days, about 30 hours of poker. I did final table it. I got 5th place for about $12,000, so I was pretty happy with that score. And this hand came from around the bubble kind of region. So we came back to day 2 with 41 players left from 240 entrants, I think it was. The bubble was at 29, so we had 12 players to go until the bubble. And this hand happened with about 4 or 5 players left till the bubble, so about 33, 34 players left remaining in the tournament. We're at the 4K, 8K blind level with an 8K button ante. So we are essentially playing 4K, 8K with a 1K ante pretty much. And a recreational player opens in middle position who's been pretty active up to this point. I've played a few hands with him. As it happens, I've 3-bet him a couple of times. Almost every time I've 3-bet him, I believe I've just had a strong hand, but I think the second or third time that I did it, he ended up folding and actually showing me ace-jack offsuit. So at this point, I'm starting to get the impression that this player is reasonably concerned with the bubble because he does look kind of pained every time he has to fold. He certainly looks like he's paying attention to the bubble, looking at the clock, things like that. So at this stage, I'm getting to the point where I'm feeling like I can start to potentially exploit this. So he opens from middle position to 18K off a stack of about 350K. And I am on the button with about 550K, and I have king 9 of hearts. So I decide that this is a hand where I could certainly think about 3-betting, but given that I'd 3-bet this player multiple times already, even though I wasn't necessarily 3-betting him that light in those situations, I didn't feel like the amount of fold equity that I would have this time around would be as high. And I definitely thought there was a chance that he would, just decide he was over it and decide to 4-bet me, and I would just have to fold. So I decided to attack him in a different way this time by just peeling on the button with king 9 of hearts. It's a little bit of a loose flat by most people's standards. I think that with the fairly tight players that were to my left, with the chip advantage that I have over this player and the fact that I can apply more pressure as a result, I think the flat is totally fine now. I think 3-betting would have been fine in many circumstances also. So I decided to go ahead and flat. The pot goes heads up to the flop, and the flop comes queen of clubs, jack of spades, 5 of clubs. So 2 clubs, we flop a gut shot straight draw plus an overcard, and the villain checks pretty quickly. Now in this situation on a board like this, I'm going to expect a recreational player who's moderately aggressive to bet almost all their strong hands almost all of the time. So I'm definitely thinking that this player's range is pretty capped when they check on this board. My range is definitely going to smash this board pretty hard. I can have a lot of combos of queen jack, queen x, like queen 10, king queen, maybe even ace queen I can flat every now and again. I can have a lot of jack x, I can have king 10, 9 10, 10 8 suited, some club combos, a lot of the ace suited club combos perhaps I might 3-bet, but certainly they can still be in my range with some frequency. And of course I can have bottom set of 5s as well. So it's definitely a pretty good board for my range. And certainly once my opponent checks, I'm feeling like my range is going to be very, very strong in comparison to their checking range. I definitely think that there's a pretty good argument for just betting my entire range on this board. I'm not necessarily sure I would have done that in this spot, but I certainly think that when I have king 9 of hearts, even though I have no backdoor, I flop a gut shot plus an overcard. Definitely a strong enough hand for me to bet and take advantage of the fact that the villain most likely has at least some hands in his range that are just instantly check folding, like maybe like pocket 7s or something like that. Ace 4 of diamonds or something like that. Those hands are definitely just going to check fold. So we do bet. We decide to bet 22K, which is I think around half pot, maybe a little bit more. Definitely setting up to potentially apply some pressure on later streets. And villain calls reasonably quickly. So at this point, I'm thinking that the most likely hands for villain to have are potentially a pocket pair that just didn't really believe me. So 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s potentially. Maybe some ace king every now and again. Maybe some jack x, ace jack, king jack, jack 10. Maybe jack 9 suited if he opens that from middle position. But this player wasn't necessarily loose enough that I'm 100% confident in that. I also block some combos of king jack and jack 9. The check call certainly indicates to me, again, a pretty capped range. I don't think this is the kind of board where a player is going to necessarily have any significant frequency of strong hands in their checking range. There's no real reason for them to be checking a lot of strong hands here when the most common tendency for recreational players is to just want to protect those hands on a board where there is a flush draw and a straight draw out there. So I certainly am in a pretty good position here. I'm definitely planning to bluff on a lot of runouts. The turn comes the 4 of spades. So the board is now Queen, Jack, 5, 4 with 2 clubs and 2 spades. So the villain checks to me once again, and I have a decision here about whether to keep bluffing and pretty much set myself up for a triple barrel, or whether to check behind and try to maybe win a smaller pot by either hitting a 10, hitting a king, or bluffing the river to some degree. My assumption here at this point is that this villain is operating in a mode where they kind of just don't really believe me in general, and I don't necessarily think that this 5 of spades on the turn, 4 of spades, sorry, is going to be a card that's actually going to make them want to fold that much of their flop check calling range. So essentially, I was betting the flop with a high frequency because I think villain is overfolding, and now that villain has overfolded the flop, they're continuing with quite a strong range, which I think means they're going to be underfolding on this turn. So I'm not really going to be barreling too much with that many bluffs on this particular turn. If I do pick up a spade draw, maybe I would obviously be barreling some club combos, some value combos, but I think a hand with no spades, no clubs, and just a gut shot, it's a good candidate to just check behind and use as a bluff on some rivers, depending on the run out, which I do. So I check behind, and the pot is now in the region of something around 80k, and we go to the river, which is the 7 of clubs. So the board now reads Queen of clubs, Jack of spades, 5 of clubs, 4 of spades, 7 of clubs. The villain reasonably quickly leads out for 45k on this 7 of clubs, and at this point, I have a decision to make. Do I just fold? My hand is pretty weak. I can certainly just fold it. It's very, very difficult for me to imagine calling with king high here. It's virtually impossible that king high is the best hand, so calling is not an option. It's basically fold or bluff raise. And in this circumstance, the decision that I ended up coming to was to bluff raise. The method by which I arrived at that was essentially to look at the villain's range and what they were repping, what they were representing, and recognize that there's only a very, very small number of combinations of club hands in that range. There's maybe Jack 10 of clubs, King Jack of clubs, Ace Jack of clubs, and that's really about it. Maybe Jack 9 of clubs, possibly, but I just don't really see them check calling any other club hands. I think that a lot of the combos of Ace 10 or Ace King of clubs would have either bet or check raised the flop. I think that there's definitely a good likelihood that Jack X of clubs could have just bet the flop anyway. Something like Ace Jack of clubs can certainly bet on that flop. So essentially at this point, I just don't really believe that the villain has clubs. I think there's a decent likelihood that recreational players in this spot can take a hand like maybe Ace Jack of hearts and just bet with it because they don't really want to have to check and then make an awkward decision. The villain could also be turning a hand like pocket eights into a bluff if they have eights with 1 club perhaps. But essentially here, my feeling is that I can definitely have a lot of club combos at this point, whereas the villain can't. I can have a lot of combos of Ace X of clubs, King 10 of clubs maybe, Ace 10 of clubs maybe, depending on whether I choose to barrel the turn or not. I can have hands like 8, 9 of clubs potentially as well. Again, a lot of these hands might conceivably barrel the turn, but I don't necessarily think that this particular opponent is taking those hands out of my range just because I didn't bet the turn. So I definitely, from my opponent's perspective, can still have some club combos. I would ordinarily prefer to be bluff raising in these types of spots with some kind of blocker. Like if I had the King of clubs or the Ace of clubs, that would make me a little more secure here. But since I'm pretty confident that villain just doesn't have a lot of club combos in their range anyway, and since I'm not flatting a lot of offsuit combos on the button in this spot anyway, on top of that, it's just not really very easy for me to try to look at this spot from a game theory perspective and say, well, I want to have a blocker in my bluffing range because otherwise I'm bluffing too much or anything like that. I'm just not really particularly concerned about over bluffing in this spot because I think villain is massively over folding, and I'm also just recognizing that if I want to have some bluffs in this spot, if I want to bluff, if villain is over folding enough, then the blocker shouldn't matter that much, and I'm just not going to have that many blockers in this spot anyway. So I do go ahead and raise to 160k. My feeling was that this was a sizing that would represent a flush pretty well. It's definitely the kind of sizing that I would make it if I did have a flush. And after I make this raise, villain frustratedly snap folds in about 2.5 seconds. So We did get the raise through, worked out pretty well. We took down a decent sized pot there on the bubble, applied some pressure to a player who I thought basically just didn't have any hands that can reasonably call a raise on that river. The player was just betting too much with too weak of a range on that river, not check calling a lot of club combos, and they essentially just made a choice to try to represent clubs in a situation where they just can't reasonably have that many combos. Obviously they do have the Jack X every now and again, but they simply just didn't have enough combos there for me to be worried about bluffing in that spot with King 9 suited. And we did get a fold, we picked up a nice pot, and that set us up pretty well. Like I said, we did go on to get 5th place in that tournament for about 12K. Ended up getting cooled off at the final table with boat over boat, blind on blind, but that's how it goes sometimes. So thanks guys for watching the video, and we'll be back with another hand very soon.